Okay, in this video we're going to talk a little bit about what's referred to as applied or technological research. Um, this terminology comes from Paul Meehl, who wrote heavily around theoretical research, particularly in psychology, and he used the term kind of technological research to differentiate from theory-driven research. That is either research aimed at developing theories or research aimed at testing theories. So let me explain what I mean by this. So essentially, applied and technological research is research that's aimed at evaluating techniques and methods that are less aimed at kind of theory-driven work. So this work is often somewhat a-theoretical, but not always. It's not necessarily a clear-cut distinction between theory-driven and a-theoretical work or this applied technological research. But what kinds of research and research questions might come under the idea of applied and technological research? Well, as I said, it's research that's aimed at evaluating techniques and methods. So this could be, for example, how good a given measurement or observation method is. So in the theory construction lecture, I mentioned the idea that strengthening a derivation chain can involve exploring measurement and observation approaches and determining the validity and reliability of them. That's an important process of being able to derive strong theories. But it's also just practically useful to know, independently of necessarily the application of any theory or anything like that, how good a particular method we use for measuring and observing actually is. We may want to take measurements for whatever reason, practically speaking, and we want to know how reliable that measurement is. We don't want our measurements to have high error. So research that's aimed at trying to identify whether a given technique is good in that sense would fall under this sort of category. We also might be interested in asking questions about which interventions work best for some outcome. Now, obviously, I mentioned that in the theory testing example, we might be interested in, for example, exploring theory-driven approaches to the evaluation of interventions. So we may have some theory why a particular intervention is better than another intervention. Maybe some underlying mechanistic explanation is why. But we may also just merely be interested in the fact that, for whatever reason, out there in practice there are these different interventions that are being used, and no one really knows or has any kind of theoretical explanations for why one might work better than the other, but it's an important practical question to know which one works better. And so we may conduct research to try and test these interventions against one another and see which one comes out best. On that topic, we can look at the perspective of interventional research and evaluating interventions from the perspectives of efficacy and effectiveness being particularly important from an applied sense. So oftentimes we look at studies which examine the efficacy of research under very controlled, what are known as internally valid conditions. Efficacy tells us that if an intervention is used, that we will observe some kind of outcome, but only if the intervention is employed with what's called a high degree of fidelity. It's delivered exactly as we intend it and it's received exactly as we intend it. More often than not, though, we recommend that interventions are engaged with. So, for example, you may have some kind of intervention that you give to an athlete to do as part of their rehabilitation from an injury or something like that, and more often than not, whilst they'll come in and receive some kind of intervention from yourselves where you'll have more control over it, you may be giving them recommendations to go away and do a particular set of exercises or stretches or some kind of mobilization technique or something along these lines. Now, under the efficacy type of research, we would explore under supervised conditions where we know that they've actually received the intervention exactly as intended, whether it produces the outcome of interest. The effectiveness question, though, instead of asking the question of does the intervention work, it asks if we recommend the intervention, does it work? And so you can think of it in the example of, say, drug research. So most drug research will take part over a series of stages. One of those stages is determining the efficacy of the drug. It's determining whether, if people take it, they improve on some outcome. After this stage, though, because in most cases drugs are prescribed, the question then becomes, if we prescribe the drug, do we see the same improvements? Because that will also allow for us to understand whether or not, factors such as people not quite taking the dose as regularly as they were intended to and things like that start to impact negatively the efficacy of the drug. Lastly, we might just be interested in whether we can predict something, even if we don't understand why. Now, of course, theories often entail deductively certain predictions about what we should observe, but theories are aimed at trying to explain phenomena and give explanations for why we might predict things. However, with emerging fields such as machine learning, we're seeing the rise of kind of what are called black box models for predicting things, where we have tons of data that we might use to predict certain outcomes, even if we don't necessarily understand exactly why certain things seem to predict other things. We can think about this in the sense of interventions again as well. Like, we could compare different interventions and see which one works best. So from a predictive sense, we would say, well, if people take this intervention, we predict that they will get better outcomes. But but this can be the case even if we don't necessarily understand why the intervention produces better outcomes. So as you can see, there are a number of different kind of applied or technological research questions that can be asked independent of theory. Now, this is not to say that there's, strictly speaking, a dichotomy between applied research and theoretical research. More often than not, some kind of predictive model also contains some explanatory power. And as has been clear from the theory testing component, theories themselves entail predictions. And so it's not completely clear-cut, but more of a kind of sliding scale as to where along that kind of spectrum any research questions that you have might fall.